Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brendan Teeling, and on behalf of Dublin City Council, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Dublin Festival of History. I'd like to welcome all of you here in the room with us in person, and also those who are watching online. Great to see you all here. Also like to welcome our ISL interpreters, Vanessa and Cormac. And I just realised they asked me to slow down at the introduction, and I didn't, so apologies for that. We're here for a talk from Kate Mosse on Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, How Women Also Built the World. Kate Mosse is an award-winning novelist, playwright, essayist and non-fiction writer, and she's the author of 8 novels and short story collections, including the multi-million-selling Languedoc Trilogy. And Kate is also the founder-director of the Women's Prize for Fiction and the founder of the Global Woman in History campaign, so she's obviously an ideal participant in our festival. We were, of course, looking forward to welcoming Kate Mosse to Dublin to talk about her book, Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries. And I know that Kate is as disappointed as we are that for reasons completely beyond her control, she wasn't able to travel. However, we are delighted that Kate has been able, through the miracle of technology, miracles doing a lot of work in that sentence, but through the technology Kate has been able to join us remotely. And we're also delighted that Irish Times journalist and columnist Cathy Sheridan is here with us to moderate this session. So I hand you over to Kate Mosse to talk about Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries. Thank you very much.
Right, I'm not sure. Can anybody hear me? Yes? Put your hands in the air if you can hear me. Hooray, thank you. That's fantastic. The first thing is an apology. This is the very first date of my book tour for my new book. And I'm not with you in person, and I am so disappointed by that. But some of you might know that I'm a full-time carer, and my wonderful mother-in-law, Granny Rosie, who lives with us, took a bit of a tumble last night. And although she's fine to the degree that about 5 minutes before starting this, she came, she's got a little bell in her room. She rang the bell and said, "Is there any chance of a gin and tonic?" So I have made her a gin and tonic, and she has the snooker on the television, so she's fine. But it meant that I couldn't really leave and come across to Dublin. So I'm so sorry not to be with you all. But it's a great pleasure to be part of this festival and to also be meeting remotely Cathy Sheridan and so many readers in Dublin and who have been so supportive over many, many years for me. And I really appreciate that. So Cathy and I are going to have a chat. She's going to interview me, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the genesis of the book and why I wrote it. No shameless promoting back there. So a few years ago, in the pandemic, as we all remember, I had a novel coming out. And I really love going out and meeting readers and being in the world of, chatting about ideas and all of this kind of thing. And suddenly none of that was going to happen, and I wasn't going to be able to do this. So I just said to a few writer friends, I said, okay, I'm going to do something just to mark publication. So just tell me the one woman from history you would like to celebrate or you think should be better known. And so you will know him. The crime writer Lee Child said the women of the Special Operations Executive in the Second World War. Anthony Horowitz said Laskarina Bubulina, who was the great female commander admiral, the only woman who's ever been an admiral in the Russian Navy, and she was part of the Greek War of Independence. The Professor Bettany Hughes said, what about Theodora of Byzantium? Professor Kate Williams said, what about Murasaki Shikabu, the author of the first novel in the world? And so it went on. And because of that, I thought, okay, I'm just going to ask a broader selection of people. So I did that thing that has never happened to me before and probably will never happen again, which is I simply put out on social media a tweet saying the same thing. Tell me the one woman from history you would like to celebrate or you think should be better known. And within days, we had thousands of people from all over the world, women and men, telling me about the person they thought was great. Now, as an old-fashioned idealist, this was wonderful because I still, despite evidence to the contrary in the UK at the moment, believe that most people want to celebrate rather than pull down, and most people want to find things that connect us rather than divide us. But this kind of felt like proof of that. So I had a tweet from a young woman in China saying, "Do you know about the Chinese poet Ding Ling?" And I didn't. I had an incredible message that came kind of privately through a woman in Saudi Arabia saying, "Do you know about the extraordinary Huda Sha'arawi, who was the person who came back from the Women's International Feminist and Peace Conference in 1923 in Paris and took her veil off at Cairo station and caused a furore. But that was the beginning of, in those days, the ending of that particular way of presenting yourself if you had to be a woman." So everything that happened was person after person after person telling me about amazing people. And many of them were my mum or my auntie or the woman that brought me up or the teacher that meant most to me. And that is history too. So I started to think I'm spending my time in the company of incredible women, many of whom I do know, but many of whom I've never heard of. And I'd like to keep doing that. So I thought I will write a book trying to look into what is history, who makes it, who decides what is preserved, who decides who is important and what is important. And out of that, I started to put some of the names together. And in this book, in Warrior Queens Quiet Revolutionaries, there are nearly 1,000 women referenced, some with quite long biographies and some with just, a quote or a couple of lines. But my aim for the book was that all of you would pick it up and have your appetite whetted, and then you would go and read books about these people, and you would add your own people. So if you do social media, it's the hashtag is #WarriorQueens. Add the person that you would like to celebrate from history, because the truth is that we've all always been there together. Women and men have always stood shoulder to shoulder, creating the world. So this is not a book about not great men. It's about saying there were lots of great women too. So if you like, it's history completed. But then always, when you're writing a book like this, there has to be something personal that makes it a book that you should write, not just anybody else who might want to write this. And there are many wonderful books out there, not least of all the great Irish writer, Clodagh Finn, who has got a fantastic sort of Twitter feed, and she has done Through Her Eyes, and she has been enormously influential in putting a lot of Irish women back into history. So what was going to make my book different? And then I discovered during lockdown, and again, maybe this wouldn't have happened if lockdown hadn't been the thing that it was that I had a great-grandmother. And I'd always heard in my family history that there was someone who wrote, but it was always really spoken of like that, like it was just a little thing she did on the side, this a little bit more closely. And what I discovered was she hadn't just written, ladies and gentlemen. She was a really famous novelist in her day. She had 14 novels. She wrote hundreds of articles, volumes of poetry, devotional tracts. She was a Baptist, and then later in her life, she converted, as it were, to the Church of England. And she was so well known in her day that when her most famous novel, The Vicar of Languedoc, was published in 1893, the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, Gladstone, himself, wrote to the Times saying, "It is to be enormously applauded that a new novel by Lily Watson has been published," which was extraordinary. But that got me thinking. So she was a middle-class, white Victorian woman with a great deal of support and, if you like, in the modern language, privilege. And she was really famous in her day. Yet you can find no reference to her anywhere. She has completely vanished from the record. So then the question you have to ask yourself is, if someone like that completely vanishes from the record, who was famous in her day, what about everybody else? What about all those women who were never recorded, who never had a book published, who never got a medal, who never had a family that was trying to preserve their legacy. And so that I turned detective, if you like. I went in search of my own family history, and I walked in my great-grandmother's footsteps, and I discovered enormous amount about my family, not least of all, and again, I didn't know this, that in that side of the family, all of the women were carriers of haemophilia, and most of the boys and men were sufferers. And this was like, you know, I came across a family tree in a deed box of letters that was found, and it was an odd family tree because not everybody was there. And there was a red H by some of the men and a green C by some of the women. And that was the coding. And I spoke to my cousin, who I'm very close with, and I said, God, I've just discovered this thing about our family. She said, oh, no, I knew that. I had to be tested. And so it took me back to the beginning, I suppose, of this book, which was, what is history? You know, it's a cliche to say that history is written by the victors, but it's a cliche because that is true. But I would go a step further and say that history is written often with an agenda. And why does it matter? It matters because always governments and rulers and heads of state use history to justify what they're doing in the present. So they will say that women have never done this. Working class people have never done that. People with disabilities have never done that. People who are black or people of color have never done this. And we know that it's not true. You just need to add common sense into the equation. And so what I wanted to do with Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries was to say, let's look at all of those pioneering writers, the doctors, the women of law, the women of courage, the women of faith, the women of conviction, the razzle-dazzlers who entertain us, who ran faster, who jumped higher, who went to the stars, and looked at those, 10 different areas of female achievement. And of course, what I discovered was that in every period of history, in every corner of the world, everybody was doing stuff. And I don't want to disappoint anybody, but mostly in the past, women didn't sit around just doing embroidery. They were doing things alongside the men they loved and the men who loved them. But women have always had to fight to have their place in history books. And a final thing before I hand over myself to Kathy to ask me some questions is that it was extraordinary to me. I learned so much and it was wonderful. It was also sometimes really upsetting, sometimes enraging. But what I suppose I came away from this project was thinking, this is a book that I would like mothers to give their sons, and fathers to give their sisters, and friends to give their friends, and grannies to give the guy down the road in the old people's home that they're all staying in, she quite fancies. It's a book for everybody, because unless we know where we've come from, we don't know who we are. And, I don't need to tell everybody in this audience this, but the mythologizing of history, the lies that are told about history in order to justify why something has happened in the present day are legion. And all we need to do, I'm afraid, is to look at Afghanistan at the moment and to think about those extraordinary brave women and girls and their fathers and brothers and all the people who were supporting them, that a year and a month ago, women in Afghanistan, there were more female MPs in Afghanistan than any other country in the world. And now women are not allowed to work at all, and girls are not allowed to go to school after the age of 13. But that was not the case a year and a month ago. So that is the key thing about learning about history and knowing who we are and putting the women back into history, is that we need to have a true narrative, not a partial narrative. And we need to understand that this beautiful, crazy, complicated, really at the moment, very challenging world was built by all of us. I've stopped. It's your turn, Kathy.
Thank you, Kate. And you actually answered all the questions I was going to ask.
No, I didn't.
A difficult 30 minutes here. But I want to begin by saying I threw a teenagey strop last night when I realised you weren't going to be here in person. Because I remember reading Labyrinth when I was actually on holiday in very near Carcassonne. And it really did open my eyes to the area. I took a whole new look at it while I was reading that book. And that is not why you're here, obviously, but I want to acknowledge that historical fiction, and in the same week as Hilary Mantel passed away, who I know you were very close to.
Well, I knew her. I met her when she was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. It then had a different name, back in 2006 for her novel Beyond Black. And although she's transformed historical literary fiction, and she is seen very much in that context, she's actually a brilliant contemporary writer. And she, in Beyond Black, it's the story of what looks like an ordinary person, a woman called Alison, who is a medium and a psychic. And she goes around doing kind of shows everywhere. But at the same time, she has the whispers of real ghosts in her head. And she was also a mistress of the Gothic and the spooky. And that wonderful thing she once said is all of the untold stories. So if you give birth to a baby boy, what happens to the baby girl that isn't born? So she had the most incredible ability to make you look at the world differently. And it was an enormous shock to everybody when she died. It wasn't expected. But I think this is what I love, in a way, about the power of books and reading and the connection the books give us, is that she would, I think, have been tickled pink that she was on the headline of the BBC News. Everybody in the whole world was being asked if they could give an interview. If you had a journalist who got your phone number, you'd be rung. She was on the front of every newspaper. And shouldn't that be the case, that the death of a great writer is front page news? And she was. And I think she would really have enjoyed that.
The other thing you had in common, Kate, was a feeling about Brexit. Hilary Mantel gave us great joy in Ireland when she said she wanted to get an Irish passport. We loved that, so we very much regret that she has died on us. But you're also, you have very strong, you're a political person. You have strong views on Brexit, for example.
I have, yes, I am a political person because I was brought up by my very beloved and very much missed mother and father to believe that what you put in, you got back, and that you should leave the world in a better state than you found it. My dad had a very strong faith. My ma was very much more to do with community work. But that idea that you've got a responsibility to the people around you. You don't just say, well, I'm all right, Jack or Jill, and pull the drawbridge up. And I'm afraid we're in a time in the UK where that is precisely what we're seeing, is, I'm okay, and therefore everybody else can, go whistle. So it's that kind of politics for me, the idea that if you have a voice, you speak up. That you don't sit on your hands, that if you see something that you think is wrong or someone who needs your support, if they want it, you offer it. You don't just go, well, it's nothing to do with me. So I found, like many people, and many, many, many people in the UK, this is what is the biggest tragedy, that there's been no representation of the people who wanted to remain. Do I think the EU is a very flawed institution? Absolutely. Do I think it needs reform? Absolutely. Do I think it's better than what we have? Absolutely. So I went on tour with 3 writer friends, Lee Child, Jojo Moyes, and Ken Follett. And it was Ken Follett who set it up. And he said, come on, guys, we're going to go and do a friendship tour. And I thought, does Europe really want us turning up? And we went to France and to Germany and to Italy and to Spain. And we just did kind of a big theatre gig, the 4 of us together, about why we felt we were stronger with our European neighbours. And as a writer of historical fiction and a writer of history, we know what happens when it's divide and rule. It's always been divide and rule. That's how these things work. This is how dictatorships and authoritarian states and totalitarian states get their way, by setting everybody against each other. So we did this tour, and I still believe that it was an act of extraordinary self-harm. But unfortunately, the time to get the referendum right was before it happened. There's no use afterwards having a moan. You know, that was the job of the politicians. And because truthfully, nobody thought the vote would go that way, they didn't really ever bother the people leading the Remain campaign to, one, look into how it was going to work, or in any way try to put a case for why they were saying what they were saying versus the other way of thinking. So do I think that we should be reversing Brexit? I think that you have to you have to actually look forward and respect the people who did vote that way. You can't say we don't like how you vote and therefore we're going to, you know, get rid of it. So it's very depressing. It's very depressing in the UK at the moment. And it's no pleasure to anybody to know that Project Fear, as it was dubbed by the Brexiteers, has turned out to be, if anything, conservative in its auguries, if you like. But, you know, again, it leads back to the book, Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries. In every period of time, there will be people who do something that, with the hindsight of history, you go, oh, why did you do that? The difference is we can see the car crash happening at the moment, and things are very difficult, but there are great things too, and we mustn't forget that.
Right, and you wrote this book actually in that spirit. You wanted to go on a positive note through COVID, and she also wrote a book about being a carer, about carers in generally during lockdown. So I don't know how you do it. You make it seem effortless, and you talk.
I'm much older than I look. This is why I'm on Zoom.
Well, I want to say I was unwrapping this very handsome 400-page book with an eye at the same time on a Channel News report about those extraordinary Iranian women who were chucking their hijabs in the fire. And the book actually, and this is truth, it fell open at page 99, where a quote from the Iranian human rights lawyer Nazria Sotoudeh jumps out. And it says, this is a pull quote on the page, "Protests against the mandatory hijab are here to stay. The only way to deal with them is to pay attention." Which actually, to me, Kate, crystallizes the message of the book.
Yeah. Pay attention. Know that nothing that most of us have, and when I say most of us, I mean 99.9% of people have, has not arrived in our laps because somebody else fought for it before us. That's the thing. It's wonderful that young women don't realize that even in living memory in the UK, you would have had to resign your job when you got married, or have your husband's signature to get contraception, or to have your husband's signature to even buy a blooming dishwasher. And by the way, I would just like to point out that Josephine Cochrane, in 1893 in Chicago, was clearly so fed up with nobody pulling their weight. She went to a shed in the back of her garden and she invented the dishwasher, Josephine Cochrane, and then patented and made an engineering company out of it. But the thing is about the book, this is a book of celebration of extraordinary women. But it is the lesson of, don't forget that everything that matters needs to be fought for and then cherished and held. Because obviously you guys had very big, referendum and debate recently about a woman's right to an abortion, a woman's right to choose. We have had certain things in this country for slightly longer in the UK. I wouldn't have thought 2 years ago that we would be where we are in America, that we would be where we are in Poland, in Nicaragua, and all of these things. So my point, I suppose, in the book is that if we learn the history of those who did those things and we walk in their footsteps, then we will know how to protect those things when they are taken away. Because almost everything, history is a pendulum. It goes backwards and forwards. And the idea that things get better generation after generation is a beautiful, beautiful dream. But it's not true. Things go backwards as well as forwards. So by knowing your history, by knowing our history, by knowing global history, being armed with information. So when someone says to you, as used to happen to me, but the reason there are no women performed at the BBC proms is because there are no women composers. And so what you've got to be able to say, forgive me, my friend. Let me give you a list of women composers. But people believe that to be true because they've not heard them played or they've not been celebrated. And when they say, there are no women doctors, there were never any women doctors before, you have to go, well, again, forgive me, my friend, in, all of these kind of things. And it was very interesting when I was writing the book, that sense that there were, as we get more into the modern age, things start to come back from much older. So in the New Kingdom in Egypt, which is, circa, 1550 BCE, women, highborn women there, and they so it's always about tax and status, they had equal rights then. And then that was all lost, and it came back again. And, in the 1901 census in the UK, there were 12,000 women teachers, 1,740,800 domestic servants who were women, and 12 women doctors. So that's the other thing when you're looking into these figures, which is there were certain areas that women were allowed to work in and others that were denied to them. Mm.
Kate, one of the things that you managed to put across is you are almost benign about this. You speak about it, you're not venting, you're stating facts. And it's very lovely to watch. But quite honestly, I swallowed this book in one day. Partly because it was sent to me quite late, but also because I wanted to keep reading. And every so often, I was really pulled up short by something like the first woman scientist to win a Nobel Prize for chemistry, Dorothy Hodgkin Crowfoot. The Daily Mail's headline was, Oxford housewife wins Nobel Prize.
Yes.
And,
I know.
Well, yes. I mean, how did you manage to keep your positive approach while you were writing this?
Well, I'm quite annoyingly perky. I mean, this is the benefit for all of you that I'm not in Dublin, because. But actually, on a serious note, what I think is that we all need to be ourselves in the way that we have these discussions and campaign. So one of the authors I quote in the book is the great American writer Audre Lorde, and she talks about being feminist, Black, lesbian, and angry. And there are many women in the book whose anger fueled the incredible things they achieved. I have found for myself, not for other people, absolutely just for myself, that I have been able to have conversations with people who might feel very differently to me about certain things by saying, no, I totally understand why you're saying that, but maybe listen to my point of view. So that's why the book is called Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries. And the title came from a friend of mine when he kind of looked at me when something had just happened and he said, you're a quiet revolutionary, aren't you? Mm-hmm. So I'm not the person with the megaphone shouting up front, going, revolution now. That isn't who I am, and it's not how I would be able to do things. But can I say, do you know what? Women are not getting the recognition they deserve in the literary world, even though the majority of novels published are by women, and the vast majority of novels bought and read are by women. Let's set up a literary prize. And that, of course, turned into the Women's Prize for Fiction. Whereas somebody else might have said to the Booker Prize and to the Pulitzer and all of the rest of it, what are you doing? You're letting women down. And neither is better. But I believe everybody in this audience will have had a moment when they made a difference, when they saw someone being picked on, or they saw that something was completely unfair. They were allowed to jump a queue and somebody else was being ignored. Every single person in this audience has at some moment stepped up for somebody else. And you will have done it in your way. And that's what I wanted to get across in the book, that there are quiet revolutionaries who are changing things one person at a time. And then there are these extraordinary, huge, huge characters who, lead armies and do all of these, the Lascarina Bubalinas, she's an obvious example. Obviously, Joan of Arc. There are so many Joan of Arcs, so-called, all over the world. Melisande of Jerusalem, who ruled as the queen in Jerusalem in the 12th century, but nobody knows her because she ruled and it was peaceful. There were no wars. So it's that really. I think if you can liberate everybody, female and male, to affect change in the way they can and make no judgments about how big or small it is, tiny steps create a big change.
Kate, I don't want to labour this thing about discovering things that made me have a little surge of rage. But I'm sure everybody here has heard of the famous photographer Robert Capa. We've all, absolutely, whether you know it or not, you've seen some of his iconic photographs. Kate, tell us about Robert Capa.
Well, yes, this is a really interesting example. So Robert Capa was actually a man and a woman. And she was Gerda Taro, and together they created the persona of Robert, Capa. And they worked together all of the time, and some of the photos were taken by him and some were her. And then they kind of, not in a bad way, but they went their separate ways. And everything that was about the work they'd done became this iconic male photographer. And she died in very tragic circumstances, whereas her contribution was forgotten. It's got a name. In science, it's called the Matilda effect. And it's named for one of the great early American feminists who was part of what was a very famous Seneca Falls Convention, which was kind of the first feminist conference in America in the late 19th century, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and she wrote a huge history of that. And it was an American science writer, Margaret W. Rossiter, in the 70s, who identified it as a particular phenomenon, which is that because male science writers didn't believe that there had been female scientists, they assumed that every woman working in science had essentially been holding the coat of the man she worked next to. When they came across a woman scientist, they just misattributed her work to the man that she worked alongside, or just assumed that she wasn't real in some cases, just that this wasn't a real person. And I think the Matilda effect holds true in almost every area. I mean, in science, it's very marked. I mean, you mentioned before, but also someone like Lise Meitner, for example, in 1944, she had to see the Nobel Prize in Chemistry being given to her male partner when she was significantly the major partner of that relationship. And there are many, many examples of this. And I can't stress enough that for me, it's not about saying that Otto Hahn, who is Lise Meitner's partner, wasn't a brilliant scientist. He was, but so was she. So it's not about taking the men out, it's putting the women in. It's like finishing the jigsaw, if you will.
And I want to repeat what Kate has just said. This book has a perfectly factual tone, that it's not event, but it's an excellent reference reference piece for if you want to look up any section of women going way back into the ancient past, including Egypt, which is, I think, partly part of your heritage, which we must talk about in a second. And we haven't half enough time for this. But Kate, I want you to tell people about the Women's Prize for Fiction, because this actually makes me laugh out loud, what happened to Kate. It shouldn't, but it does. So in 1990, what year was it? 1992?
91 was the Booker Prize.
Yes, and it was an all-male shortlist. And so Kate Mosse and a few friends decided this isn't on. Not in an angry way, but as a way of looking at how literature is valued. Am I right about that?
Yes, exactly. And it wasn't even that the judges had chosen an all-male shortlist, because they have every right to do that. Because if they are the 6 books that they most valued and loved, then that's fine. The point was nobody noticed. So a lot of us said, can you imagine if they put out an all-female shortlist? That would have been seen as an act of rebellion, of politics. But because it was an all-male shortlist, the assumption that, that idea of the great men of literature, nobody commented on it at all until the list was announced. And then people went, oh, you're right. They're all men. Often you just need to flip things on their head to see how they would look from the other point of view. And then that's what happened. So we thought, well, we'll set up our own prize and it will be fun. Nobody will sit around in black tie going for dinner. We will announce the winner quite early on and have a big old party and everybody will dance. And they have been dancing ever since.
But Kate, tell us about the launch. So Kate is 5'2". I don't know if you all know that she's quite short. And she, so there was I cannot tell you, I was listening to a Radio 4 program, which was, I think it's called This Cultural Life. Yes. Yeah. And Kate told the story about the launch of the Women's Prize for Fiction. and the vitriol that was around it. And this show included clips from some of the men commenting about this prize. And it was vile, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, thank the Lord there wasn't social media then. I'm quite courageous in my quiet way, but I'm not sure I would have been able to cope with what all of my friends who are female MPs have to cope with. In those days, people had to ring up your home and speak to your husband first before they told you were awful. People couldn't get at you in the same way. But they look a bit daft now, don't they? So that's fine. This is the long burn. I mean, the thing that was really interesting was...
Can we just talk about you falling through the box?
Yeah, of course. So I am quite short. I wear big shoes, but I am quite short and 5'2". And I was announcing the long list, the very first long list in 1996. And I arrived and the lectern was not built for me. So I looked like, one of those comedy cartoon animals, in a Tom and Jerry, sitting behind a car where you can only see the ears of the rabbit. Nobody could see me at all. So we agreed that I needed a box, and they found a box. And I stood on got up, stood on the box and said, "Ladies and gentlemen," and of course went through the box because it was not a very strong box. So that was a terrible opening, but it was worse, actually. I don't know if they ran this bit, Kathy, that when I announced that we were doing the prize and that we'd got a sponsor, it was going to, a commercial sponsor, the mobile phone company Orange, who in the end put millions into literature and to supporting women, and really incredible commitment. And I launched the prize. I announced why we were doing it and all the statistics, and the facts were very stark. 60% of novels published were by women, 75% of novels bought were by women, fewer than 9% of novels ever shortlisted for literary prizes were by women. So it wasn't a problem about women being published, it was a problem about women's work being honoured and seen as literature and valuable. So the figures spoke for themselves. However, obviously, I made this, great speech and launch and all the rest of it at the ICA in London, and I was very, enthusiastic, and we all were. We were really proud of what we were trying to do, and there were lots and lots of men part of this. As much anybody who loves reading was part of this. But I didn't know the press then. I didn't recognise anybody, and I'd never done a huge press conference before. And so I finished my thing, and I said, any questions? And a tweedy arm, which should have been the clue, at the back of the hall went up, like this. And I said, "Gentleman at the back." And he said, "Are you a lesbian?" And that was genuinely the very first question asked for the Women's Prize for Fiction.
He was from the Daily Express, wasn't he?
He was from the Daily Express, yes. And to which the only answer was, "No, are you?" And then everybody laughed. But it set the tone. And the thing that was interesting, in a way, was that I went on radio show, television show, newspaper show after show after show after show, being very positive about what we were doing, why we were doing it, all of this. And what was depressing was that almost every single media outlet tried to find a woman to put against me, because that is what they wanted, is the idea of women disagreeing with women. And I could cope with that because people have the right to not think it was the right thing to do. It's what we were doing. They don't have to approve. But what I found demoralizing was that quite often when we came off air, they'd take their microphone off and said, "I think it's a great idea, but my editor said I have to come on and argue against you." And the thing I would think then is, you need to have some principles, my dear. If you don't agree with this, then don't say it.
Yeah.
Because that, we can see, is how terrible things happen. It's that phrase, I can't remember it, but it's when good people stay silent, or many of you will know the quote I'm referring to. I can't remember what it is. And that just, I suppose, confirmed for me in my sort of campaigning self that this is not a popularity contest. This is not about not rocking the boat. If you genuinely think something is wrong, then it's your responsibility to say so.
Kate, going back to the book, a couple of things emerge that are quite unexpected. For example, it's almost a sidebar that the Royal College of Physicians in Ireland and this great institution, Trinity College, were awarding degrees to women before the likes of Oxford and Cambridge. Yeah. Am I right about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about it. It was a wonderful thing. The chapter on teaching and education, there was this extraordinary thing that there was pressure for women to be allowed to learn. And in the end, some of the institutions in England in particular started to allow women in, some in Scotland, some in Wales. But the lunacy was that they would allow a woman by the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century to do all the studying and to take the exams, but would not give them a degree. And Oxford and Cambridge were two of the worst offenders. So Oxford didn't start to give women degrees until a year after the passing of the Sex Discrimination Removal Act, which was 1919, after the end of the First World War. So Oxford started to let the women have their degrees from 1920 onwards, and awarded them not posthumously, but backdated them, as it were. Cambridge University didn't allow women to have their degrees until 1947. Whereas in Trinity College Dublin, there was an understanding that this was ridiculous. If people were able to do the work and doing all of this kind of thing, then why were women being discriminated against? So many women from the UK came across to Ireland. It was kind of a famous route in order to get their degrees here instead. So, you were well ahead of most of the UK.
Well, hooray for Trinity.
Hooray for Trinity.
Well done, everybody. Kate, I'm going to pass myself to the audience for questions. I hope you have lots of questions. Can I see a willingness to ask a question? Anybody? Two women up here in the. If you would just wait for the mic to get to you, and then if you wouldn't mind standing up so we can see you.
I've been asked, should I stand up? And I said, do I have
Would
to?
you,
So, will I stand up?
If you wouldn't mind, that'd be great.
Kate, I've really enjoyed your presentation, and it's opened my eyes. I'm always interested in the comment that women were not allowed to be doctors, right? That is true, but women were nurses. I'm one of them. And part of it was because we were not allowed to get a degree, and that was really worked on in the 19th century when they didn't want women to get involved in degrees. And I suppose my comment is that we were quiet warriors as nurses, right? And I can give you an example. There was a woman I worked with, she happened to be a nun in the 1980s in public health when contraception wasn't allowed in Ireland. And she had trained in the UK, and she used to go to the UK and bring condoms back with her. So I think she was definitely a quiet warrior. The other thing is, in the inner city, when I met women in the 1980s, they actually told each other stories of how to get treatments. And one of them was female sterilisation, where you weren't allowed to have it in Ireland. And one woman, I happened to be at a bingo session one time with them, and one woman said, oh, you're not having any more? No. And, a nod and a wink and stuff. And the other woman said, heavy periods. That's the story. And she got her, so I would love to see us to move on a little bit from women not being allowed to become doctors, which is true. But actually, I have worked in areas where I saw people die, not because they didn't have a doctor, but because they didn't have a nurse. I would really love to see that we begin to celebrate what women did out of choice sometimes, and also because they weren't allowed to do something else. But it didn't mean that they were any less than doctors.
Okay, Kate, do you want to?
Really?
Yeah, no, I think that's
Thank you very much.
No, thank you. That is a brilliant point. And all the way through the book, I have doctors and nurses, precisely that. I mean, I'm sure many of you know the very, to me, extraordinary woman, Emma Duffin, who was in Belfast and who was a very extraordinary nurse working through the Blitz bombing of Belfast in 1941, but is as important a diarist about women's experiences in the First World War as Vera Brittain, but yet she's not celebrated in the same sort of way. And so I completely agree with you about doctors and nurses. the thing within the book is that both are there. But when you look back to the very earliest beginning, and the word doctor is quite modern, the word that would have been used is physician. So the very first female physician is considered to be Agnodice in the 4th century BCE. And the story there is about that men weren't allowed to touch women. So how could women be treated? So essentially it's a lose-lose for women. So she disguised herself as a man and worked treating female patients. And then her rivals essentially said, this is outrageous, you're not supposed to be touching women and all of these. So the story goes that she had to lift up her robes to prove that she was a woman, and therefore she was allowed to touch women, and that the law in Athens forbidding female physicians changed. So the thing is, you're absolutely right in the modern era that a lot of the reasons that there's a focus on doctors is the idea that that's more important. It isn't more important. But all the way through history, there has been precisely this, particularly in the Elizabethan period, women treating other women medically. But because it was not allowed, it wasn't recorded. And therefore, the idea was that women didn't do these things. And so you're completely right. Nurses are in my book as much as doctors, and it's all part of the same story. And I can't remember because this is my very first event for this book. This is the beginning of my book tour, and I'm not even there. So this was kicking off the book tour. But there's quite a lot of people that I quote in the book, both nurses and doctors, women saying, the reason I'm doing this is fellow feeling, essentially. That precisely as you say, that women looking out for other women. It's really important.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Was there a lady behind you there?
Up and standing up. I have moved from being an enraged victim of the 70s, not shaving my legs because it was a sign of the patriarchy, to having a more nuanced appreciation of the whole thing about men and women. I think my question kind of is, a lot of us more mature ladies will have had the experience of suddenly becoming invisible. And I think it's not, so now I think, no, the fact that women have been written out of history wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't necessarily that the fellas just decided, no, we're definitely not going to write her in, but it was that they literally did not see the women. I had the experience only the night before last of sitting at a bar where there was nobody else. Guy working behind the bar, looked quite busy. I was being patient, waiting. Guy comes up, puts up his hand to be served. And I then yelled at the guy behind the bar and said, hello, I would like to order my drink, please. And I actually said to him, I said, did you not see me? And he looked at me quite blank and said, no, he literally did not see me. And so I think, is there an element of that, do you think? And is there anything we can do about changing that?
Thank you.
Well, that's a lovely question. I am very involved in a lot of caring organisations as a full-time carer, and spend a lot of time with older people. So this is something that I am very passionate about, and I think that there is absolutely an invisibility of women, and it's also quite often dishonest. So I'm in my 60s. And people then say to me, and they think it's a compliment, well, you don't look like you're in your 60s. It's like, I think that's meant nicely, or it might be not. But there is absolutely a truth that women become invisible. This is why Miss Marple is the great unsung feminist hero of literature, because she's a woman who is not married. She's not there on her own terms. She is overlooked and patronised by everybody around her, and she always gets her man.
And you've contributed to some Miss Marple stories, in fact.
I absolutely have. But to answer the lady's question, I think that sometimes it's true that it is just that the men at the time didn't notice. But other times it is not true. It is an active decision. The example I'll give you is one of the women in the book who was suggested in my campaign by Claire Balding. And she suggested the great British footballer Lily Parr. She's the only female footballer who has a statue to her, and more people probably know about her since the Lionesses' triumph in the summer than they did before. But this is an example of deliberate attempt, as we are seeing in Afghanistan, for example, or indeed in America, where women's body autonomy is being taken away. With that, women's football was the biggest sport in the UK during the First World War. On the Boxing Day match between the most famous two teams, and Lily Parr played for a team called Dick Kerr Ladies, there was a crowd of 48,000. And most of the women's teams were attached to munitions factories. And it was a really huge and popular sport. When the men came back from war and the FA, they looked at that and they didn't like it. And so the FA said actively, we will not let any women's teams play on your pitches. So they decided to kill the women's game. It wasn't that they didn't notice it. They decided to stop it. So I think within the book, you'll see, and it's lovely that Kathy was kind of like, had steam coming out of her ears, and other people have just been going, oh my God, I never knew that. But that's the point of the book, is that sometimes, you know, we all kind of assume, and you guys are all sitting together in this room, that everybody who's remotely, in inverted commas, normal, thinks that women and men and people of colour and people with disabilities, people of different faiths, that basically everybody should be treated as a person and they should be judged on what they do and they say. We assume that that's what everybody feels. That isn't what everybody feels. There are and have been people who do not think women matter as much as men and that girls matter as much as boys. So for me, it's unpicking all of that and looking into all of the things that we can do to change that. And in terms of older women, the most important thing we could do is precisely what you did, which is go, hello. You know, we mustn't be complicit in becoming invisible. You know, we need to get our drink at the bar. Always get your drink at the bar.
Would anybody else like to ask a question? Oh, we have a few up the back there. 3. If you wouldn't mind standing up, because you really are very far away.
Very nerve-wracking not being able to see what's happening here. It's like, oh.
Yes, sorry, Kate, I realised
the microphone's been nicked by somebody and they've scarpered with it, you know.
I just wanted to say that I've really enjoyed hearing you talk about the nuances of women in history. As a disabled woman, I too feel like we're often ignored, not really seen.
Yes.
Since becoming disabled, I have thought about it a lot more, but I realised that throughout my life, possibly because I'm more feminine presenting and I like to wear lots of pink and girly things, I've been treated like a kid and infantilized. It has happened a lot more since being disabled, but I wonder, do you feel like the rampant infantilization of women has a role to play in our history being ignored?
That is a brilliant question, actually. Thank you for that. Yes, I do. I think that what often happens is the idea that someone who presents in a particular way is seen as not serious, and other people are seen as serious. And so in my day of working in an office, which is back in the 80s, I was told taken aside by wonderful women who were essentially trying to mentor me and saying, you know, it's great that you've got, at that stage, I had kind of cropped hair and you wear, you know, DMs and, you know, dungarees and stuff. But if you want to be taken seriously, then you can't dress like that. Now, there is an element of truth in that. We all decide the public persona we put out there. And how we want to be treated. We all have our public selves and our private selves. But I think that within history, when you see many of the women in the book, there is an absolute sense that many women were encouraged to over-feminize themselves in order to be acceptable, and therefore encouraged, if you like, to you can get what you want if you play a certain sort of game, which is that you're very helpless and you need people to help you and all of that kind of stuff. And the women who kind of stood up and said, I want to be treated equally on this level, were often seen as unfeminine. And I had a wonderful historian who helped me with the book. Read it when I'd written it, because I really wanted to be sure that I'm sure I've made loads of mistakes you always do in a book with this many facts and names and stuff in it. But she's called Alice E. Smith. And I'd been doing the same kind of thing, which was every time you came across somebody who was described as wearing men's clothing, I thought, well, hey, that sounds really exciting. She sounds like, pirate queen. And felt really like, and my next novel is basically lesbian pirate, so woohoo. There's a lady there I can see, I can see you next to the man in the yellow. I'll come back into Dublin. Yep, you're obviously my core audience for this new novel. Brilliant. It's called The Ghost Ship, out in July, madam. Anyway, that's a diversion. But then what was interesting is that Alice said, the thing is, Kate, that in the past, when women were described as wearing men's clothing, we think that sounds powerful and sexy and strong. They were doing it in order to make it clear that they weren't a real woman, and therefore that everything that happened to them, they deserved. So it was quite a sinister thing, if you like, rather than an empowering thing. Now, our narrative is an empowering thing. So I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I hope everybody will find important in the book is that it was very important to me. My mother-in-law, Granny Rosie, who is a legend, and I can hear the wheelchair because I assume that the tide has gone out and the gin and tonic has been drunk, and she would be really quite keen on the second gin and tonic because the snooker is on. But she is, in a wheelchair, and many of her friends, of course, because they're in their 90s, are. And when I was writing the book, there isn't a section on people who have disabilities, because that's not the point. The point is that people with disabilities have been, in every period of history, doing incredible things. So it's oddly the same kind of thing. The way that people are undermined by, oh, well, they look like this. They're too feminine, they're too masculine, they're too this, they're too that. It's all part of the same attempt to undermine a woman's credibility. And it doesn't really matter what particular stick they use to beat anybody with. It is a deliberate attempt to undermine people's authority. And so I think you should carry on wearing your pink and shouting very loudly if you want to shout, or be very quiet, but send people notes to make other people shout for you.
Well, I'm being told to wrap up, which is most unfortunate. Kate, you can't see it, but we have such an engaged audience. And there was a sigh of dismay when I said we have to wrap up. But I'm going to ask you one last thing. You're taking this on the road. You're going to become a performer.
I am. This is part of the same thing. The joy, if you spend a lot of time with people in their 80s and 90s, and I cared for my dad and my mum before Granny Rosie, and everybody lives here with us. Well, obviously my parents are now gone. Is that, you know what, you hit your 60s, you feel really young. You don't feel like, and I think that there is a kind of attitude of mind with this is, you mentioned the Miss Marple stories. I'm the same age as Miss Marple when she first appears.
Good Lord.
There we are.
She looks much older.
I know.
She looks about 92, actually.
Yeah, no, Zoom is great. So the thing is, a theatre producer approached my agents and said, we love this book, Warrior Queens Quiet Revolutionary. There are all these incredible women we've never heard of. What would Kate think about doing a one-woman show and doing a big theatre tour? And I thought, well, I'll give it a go. I'll give it a go. What else can I say? So it starts in March, and it's UK to start with, just just sort of mainland UK, as it were. And but there are talks about taking it. If it works, we'll go elsewhere. And it will be a proper show, with a first half and a second half and an interval where you can buy a tub. And it will have a set and music and noise and images and all of the rest of it. And it's really exciting. Maybe nobody will come. Maybe I'll be really rubbish. But you can't just not try, can you? It's that wonderful Samuel Beckett phrase that's always misquoted. And the bit that's left out is the most important bit. And it's try again, fail again, never mind, fail better. And I'm going to take the show on the road with that philosophy.
Kate Mosse.
Thank you. And thank you, Kathy.
Well, I hope you can hear the enthusiasm in the audience, and your show has to come here. I mean, we are a very important part of of Europe, I'm happy to say.
Exactly. I am amongst friends.
Listen, and thank you for honouring us with your very first talk about this book.
Yeah, you have helped me launch the book.
Well,
so thank you all.
I am beyond honoured. Cormac Kinsella is beyond honoured. We're all delighted with you. Kate Mosse, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the book, everyone. Have a lovely rest of the day.